second microphone. And I'd like to welcome our two very distinguished guests from Rabat and Oxford. We've got with us Hakima Haite, who's a global leader in sustainability and climate change. She's the first female president of Liberal International. She's a former environment minister for Morocco, bringing COP22 to Morocco. And she was a vice president of the crucial COP21 talks in Paris that everyone now refers to. Also with us is Arunma Oteh. She's currently executive in residence at the Saïd Business School and an academic scholar at St Antony's College, Oxford. She's researching capital markets, economic development and fintech, and she does this on the back of being treasurer of the World Bank following a distinguished career in Nigerian financial services and the African Development Bank. It's an amazing panel and it puts the global into Jeffy. So tonight we'll hear from each of our speakers and then we'll take the opportunity to bring them together for a fireside chat, which is perhaps appropriate given the analogy we were using about a burning building earlier. So I'd like to invite Hakima first to address us.
Thank you so much for the nice presentation, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to participate to this hybrid event organized by the Global Ethical Finance Initiative and the Adam Smith Institute. I really would have loved to be present in person because chemistry matters. But anyway, I'm happy to join from Rabat and to be here, even though virtually. And I thank you for the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, not far from the university where you are all together today, St. Andrews, more than 20,000 people and 200 parties with different levels of economic development, different contexts, histories, backgrounds, to try to reverse climate change. This extraordinary gathering of heads of states, ministers, negotiators, are expected to deliver on a consensual basis on issues where their interests are not necessarily the same. So believe me, it's not an easy task, and I wish them to succeed. The first week is over now. We have less than 1 week to go. So what have been achieved? As the General Secretary of the UN said, our house is burning. The targets announced in Glasgow would result in warming of 2.7 degrees by 2100 compared to the pre-industrial levels. The world is currently lagging far behind in the fight to prevent global warming rising to 1.5 degrees C. The bitter reality is that since the Paris Agreement was adopted, the CO2 emissions are in a constant increase instead of decrease. The past decade was the warmest on record. Shortage of water, floods, increase of the sea levels, natural disasters are threatening life on a daily basis in many regions, not only those known for their vulnerability as Africa or the small island, but everywhere in the world. The cost of inaction is becoming unaffordable. As we all know, that the world needs to halve emissions over the next decade if we want to reach net carbon emissions by the middle of the century. But I think all of you know that, and you know about that. Now, what next steps should be fulfilled if we really and truly want to achieve the objective? I personally think that there are 4 crucial conditions to maintain the momentum and to allow everybody to be on board. First, trust. The central point to maintain the trust is the respect of the commitments. First commitment, which is, in my opinion, more important than finance. We need to see concretely the developed countries embarked on the right trajectory, which will lead all of us to the carbon neutrality in 2050. I remember that when we were negotiating adaptation in the Paris Agreement, some friends from Europe and the United States used to tell us the most we mitigate, the less we need to adapt. And indeed, at that time I was supporting this thesis. But today, this thesis is not valid anymore. The needs for adaptation are becoming more pressing because no effort has been made to decrease the CO2 emissions. Climate change is becoming a monster, disseminating hunger, conflicts, producing climate refugees, insecurity, and sometimes even killing the most vulnerable beyond us. The second point is coherence or coherency. Parties and governments should commit to implement more coherent policies, especially related to coal and fossil fuel subsidies. Governments cannot call for carbon neutrality on one hand and continue investing in coal and subsidies in fossil fuel sectors. Effective climate action means that governments' policies should move in the same direction. This will determine, in my opinion, how fast we can make the low carbon transition a reality. In COP26, more than 40 countries agreed to stop investing in coal next year. Indeed, it's very good news, but the most coal-dependent countries, China, USA, and India, have not signed up. And the urgency now requires that the emitters commit to stop all new investment now and communicate in a transparent way on their plans and deadline to phase out coal. That should have been done since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. Coming now to the subject of this conference, finance. Who should pay? This is my third point. In 2009, developed countries pledged 100 billion a year to help poorer nations by 2020 to adapt themselves and to tackle climate change. And last week, we heard that this goal has still not been met and could slip to 2023. During the first week of COP26, it was reported that $76 billion were mobilized to finance climate-related projects. This was for 70% public finance, invested for 75% in mitigation projects, on the basis of loan to be paid back. And this part represented 70% of the allocation to mitigation. Adaptation makes up only 20% of the climate finance. And analysts, international institutions told us that the contributors, the most developed countries, are not contributing their fair share toward meeting the 100 billion goal. And this was based on the size of their economies and their green gas emissions. The US, for example, has the lowest provision of any developed country relative to its gross national income, and it contributes around 0.03%. If every developed country were to make the same effort relative to the size of its economy to reach the 100 billion goals, countries would need to contribute 0.22% of their gross national income. This is why it's important that this week, COP26 delivers within the transparency mechanism on an approach to measure CO2 emissions to allow us to track our joint effort. We all see that our indices are not ambitious and will not put us on the right trajectory in the middle of this century. And also this week, COP26 should define how climate finance effort might be fairly allocated among contributor countries. Who pays again? This is difficult because it's paradoxal to see that the world is putting over trillions of a year for fossil fuel subsidies, and the parties to the UNFCCC are negotiating for 26 years now for $100 billion to tackle the effect of the emissions of this fossil fuel sector. If you ask me who should pay, I will answer those whom are giving subsidies and financing subsidies to fossil fuel sector. This money, and I'm talking about the trillions of dollars dedicated to fossil fuel subsidies, should go progressively to foster carbon neutrality. It's why it's crucial that COP26 delivers on the Article 6 related to carbon mechanism this week to allow us to have an harmonized framework for carbon pricing. There is a patchwork of carbon pricing all over the world. If you take France, the price of carbon is 56 euro per ton. If you go to China, it's less than $2 per ton. So we need to tackle climate change, and we need really to implement the change. We need to have this mechanism, and COP26 will be judged on the issue of the second week, because pledges we know, but the delivering on mechanism is the responsibility of UK, and I wish that UK will succeed. Now, since the Paris Agreement was adopted, no agreement was reached to answer directly to this question: who pays? A big division is still existing between the North and the South concerning the origin of the funds, public, private, the vehicles or channels, will it banks or the dedicated fund like that was created in under the convention to deal with such money, like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, etc. The other criteria are the effort based on the emissions or the historical emissions, the criteria of the gross national income, etc., etc. So discussions are undergoing now, and we will see by the end of this week what are the results. Now, let me give you my personal opinion. The fact is that finance will power the acceleration of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. This investment in the southern world represents a huge opportunity for the North to reach the carbon neutrality. We are talking about billions of people that have no access to energy. We are talking about billions of people who have no access to water and sanitation, and millions of agricultural land not yet exploited. We are talking about infrastructure that is not existing yet. So everything is to be built and to be done. And if you want to reach the global neutrality, this is where to invest. So imagine with me that the South makes the same choices of development and industrialization than the North to develop. The world will never reach the carbon neutrality. This is the answer. So when leaders are launching the deforestation initiative in the South, and this is what happened last week, they are decreasing the CO2 emissions in the North and globally. And this is the reality. So in my opinion, this should be public money, which will allow to leverage an extraordinary amount of private money. The North has the financial capacity, the technologies, the innovation. So this is a huge opportunity for business if conditions of coherency are meted. And this is what I said at the beginning of my remarks. And this is also the best way to give some insurance to the private sector to be part of the global transformation and to invest its money in the southern projects. And believe me, the private sector is ready, and you can see it through the mobilization in the green zone and the leadership of your champion, Nigel, and the Marrakesh Partnership, the Race to Zero, and all the pledges done by all the sectorial coalitions. So the private sector is really ready. My latest point is responsibility. A fundamental property of greenhouse gas emissions that their location is irrelevant. Wherever it's emitted, a ton of CO2 has, from a climate change perspective, exactly the same impact everywhere in the world. And an action to tackle climate change will bring its benefit worldwide. Climate change has no nationality, no borders, no religion. Tackling climate change is our responsibility because it's threatening all of us. This is to say that even if the Paris Agreement is implemented under what is it called the common and differentiated responsibility, the biggest emitters in the emerging world, and I'm thinking to China, India, Russia, etc., should take their part of responsibility and foster effort to increase their ambitions and switch their economy towards a green or a low carbon economy. Today, climate change has destroyed the frontiers and doesn't oppose anymore the North and the South, but it puts all of us in the same basket. Either we will win together or lose together. So all about climate change is change. And with the recovery plan from COVID-19, we have here a historical opportunity to change. Thank you.
That was a very impassioned plea to share our net zero future, and I think very well said. Thank you very much.
Hearing you. I'm not hearing you.
Oh, is that better? No. I'll let the production team work on that in the background. Arunma, can you hear us in Oxford? Yes, thank you very much. Arunma.
Absolutely, I can.
Excellent. So I'd now like to invite you to address the audience.
Well, thank you, Allan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak alongside Hakim, Dame Susan Rice, and Santon. But I have to say thank you for all that Jeffy, the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, has done to ensure that finance is at the forefront of addressing the challenging issues of our time. You had asked that I share some of my impressions of COP26 and what has happened over the last 9 days, as well as some perspectives on financing. I, like Hakim, would have loved to be in Glasgow, and you and I had talked about why, but thanks to technology, we could all follow from where we are. Hakim has talked a lot about the details of COP26 and where things are. I would just say that I agree with her. I would, however, add that some of the goals that were set have been met. I think there are bolder promises in terms of higher nationally determined contributions. As she mentioned, there's some new deals like reforestation and methane. There's some emphasis on nature and biodiversity, and I hope that continues going forward. I do believe there's a better appreciation that actions speak louder than words. So more people are calling for action than in the previous COPs. There's also a greater private sector participation, and I'm excited about the commitments that I hear from the private sector in respect of the decarbonization agenda. But the analogy for me of my assessment of COP26 is that we may have had a nice flamboyant wedding ceremony in the last 9 days. I think the negotiations I liken to the family members now focused on the enjoyable part right after the wedding as to who pays, so the negotiations that are ongoing. But for me, what is important is to put in place the building blocks of a marriage that will ensure marital bliss, which is my analogy for the actions that we need to be taken so that we can get to net zero. it is not sufficient, as we all know, to make promises or marriage vows. You have also to keep those promises. One example, of course, which has already been mentioned by Hakim, is, in my view, the dent on the perception of the commitment of rich nations to the $100 billion per year that they made in respect of developing countries starting in 2020. As Sir Antoine mentioned, this was first announced in Copenhagen in 2009 and reinforced in Paris in 2015. Yet, it has not been fulfilled, even though then the needs are much more today. This is unfortunate because we also know the value of front-loading resources. Why is finance critical to achieving net zero? First of all, the sums are huge. And I will just share some data that's been thrown out in the last few days. So Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney authored an article on Monday in which they talked about a ballpark figure of $100 trillion as what we need. Developing countries and allies, I think 24 other countries, are proposing that they need at least $1.3 trillion per year till the end of the decade. Estimates last year, which is the latest that I have, on investments in renewables and clean energy sources is that it's about $300 billion a year. Yet we need about $2.5 trillion to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees centigrade. The world has enormous resources to tackle the climate emergency. Just look at how the rich nations responded to COVID-19. The numbers are anything from $13 trillion to $22 trillion in 1 year. For me, this is evidence that the world has sufficient resources. Going forward, though, whatever sums are left of the stimulus package, I would suggest should be deployed for greening the economy. We must also deploy capital to productive users and more efficiently, and as Hakim pointed out, leverage the private sector better. Instead of us using funds to enable wars around the world, we should use those funds to enable climate action. Let me just give you some data. From 2013 to 2019, developed nations spent $8.6 trillion on climate expenses. I said $8.6 trillion. And last year, it was $1.3 trillion. That's the same amount that developing nations are asking for annually. Public sector resources, of course, cannot finance the zero carbon agenda alone. We do need the private sector to come on board. I would say not just for the resources, but because they foster innovation, they leverage market forces, and through some of the mechanisms, including particularly stock exchanges, there's greater public engagement and stakeholder engagement. There are various estimates about how much the private sector assets are. The Green Climate Fund says it's about $200 trillion. Some others say it's up to $350 trillion. And we see evidence of the excitement of the private sector when you look at initiatives like the Glasgow Finance Alliance, which galvanized interest from 450 entities from 45 countries that control around $130 trillion. And by the way, this is up from $70 trillion in April 2021. But more specifically, we're seeing excitement around ESG investing. The Pension and Investments Journal estimates that this investing tripled to $40.5 trillion in 1 year from 2019 to 2020. I feel, though, that if we can manage the private sector risk perception, that we'll probably get more. So risk perception of innovation, of new solutions, and particularly of developing countries. Otherwise, why would some investors decide to buy negative yielding assets, i.e., lend money, pay people money to hold your money? When many of these new climate solutions offer reasonable returns. And for those who don't know, this number has been in the double digits. So the data that I have is from Bloomberg, which in September estimated that assets yielding negative returns was at least $11 trillion. What will help in mitigating this risk perception? It's really public sector resources, how they're deployed. Public sector resources should be risk capital. They should provide the first loss protection to the private sector through blended finance instruments. An example, of course, is political and partial risk guarantees provided by bilateral and multilateral agencies. Other examples are blended co-lending programs, syndications, public-private partnerships, disaster risk management bonds, many of which are being used today, which can be done at scale and which can focus more on climate issues. I do believe that the advent of green bonds, blue bonds, and other thematic bonds also provides benefits that will attract greater involvement of private sector. Investors can monitor use of proceeds. There's trust that is built because of a second-party opinion and a third-party verification. There are various platforms. One example that I like very much is the African Development Bank Africa Investment Forum, which literally brings together the public sector, the private sector, bilaterals and multilaterals in a room so that any thorny issues are dealt with right away and capital deployed efficiently. So I'm advocating capital being used more productively, capital leveraging the private sector, and deploying capital more efficiently. The other thing that I like that's going on is that valuations and cost of capital are now the carrots and the sticks to directing resources towards clean energy solutions and away from fossil fuels. The example that I like to cite always, and I checked the data today, is Tesla is worth 20 times in terms of market value than General Motors in terms of today's share prices. So people are voting with their feet, and we need to do more of this. And that's, in my view, a reason why market forces are still very, very useful. Financial reporting also promotes common standards and taxonomy, something that is very critical as we make progress in terms of this transition. It fosters transparency and accountability. So we need to leverage the power of financial reporting to broaden the definition of success from profitability to the net impact or contribution of each entity to society. Because that mindset shift is so, so important. But most importantly, we need to have an optimistic view of this climate emergency, that it does create opportunity. Moody's, in a report that they published today, estimates that climate transition is a $45 trillion opportunity over the next 2 decades and could boost global GDP by 25%. In my view, it will even be a greater opportunity if we take a holistic approach and if we don't focus on intellectualizing climate issues. And that holistic approach means tackling poverty and inequalities at the same time. It is sad that the 10 richest people, and by the way, they're all men, so I should say the 10 richest people who are all men, according to Oxfam, earned an extra $500 billion during the pandemic. This could have financed the promise of $100 billion made to developing countries for 5 years fully. Or, according to the World Economic Forum, provide vaccines for the entire world. It is sad that 3.5 billion people, about half of the world, are surviving on $5 per day. And of course, this includes 800 million people who have to go to bed hungry every day. So permit me to quote from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And I'm sure he's sad that many years after that, what he predicted about society is still with us. That quote is, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the greater part of the members are poor and miserable. I repeat, no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the greater part of the members are poor and miserable. We need an equitable, just, fair transition to net zero. This will help us have a world that is more cohesive, a world that is more peaceful, while keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees centigrade. Thank you.
We seem to have lost Hakima again, but thank you so much. It's always a delight to have people speaking who are so well informed that they anticipate many of my questions, and I think the energy you brought and the structure you brought to both of your responses was magnificent. Just if I may, just a couple of questions just to build on some of the comments that you made. I mean, we spoke earlier about, you know, the world is awash with capital. There's no problem with finding money. There's tons of it about. I suppose two questions. You spoke a little bit about how to mobilize the money into developing economies, but I suppose one question is how can developing economies pull together projects to make them investable? You know, what could they be doing to draw attention and attract that capital in?
Absolutely an important question, Alan. So first of all, they need to make the projects bankable. And to make a project bankable, you need the operating environment to be right. So it's back to basics. I mean, I don't believe that any investor should be altruistic. I would even say that philanthropists need to make sure that where their money goes is where it's most useful. So the operating environment is number one. And the operating environment has everything from the governance issues and issues around making sure that there's no corruption, to making sure that that there are sectoral policies that are supportive of that sector, and that there are, you know, people can take their money away if when they need to, that there's a liquid market, but also that the risks that they incur, the risks that they were aware of that they would incur, that there will be no risks due to uncertainties around regime changes and other issues. So that's the first one in terms of what, you know, I always say that not even the citizens of a country invest in that country because they love the country. I mean, people want to make sure that the return on their investments is based on the investments that they've made rather than based on other issues.
And the other issue you raised was obviously adaptation versus mitigation. I mean, obviously, the longer we leave it, the more of this 100 billion that might disappear, just dealing with the catastrophe rather than with actually building a new future. Where do you think the balance lies between, you know, dealing with the future or building a new future and adaptation? Because, you know, we heard earlier, you know, we have to start now. The next 10 years are the most critical.
I think Hakim touched on her evolution from a focus on mitigation to adaptation. For those who are not familiar with the concepts, you know, one focuses on the measures that allow you to reduce the impact, while others focus on issues related to capacity. I do think that without a focus on adaptation, sufficient focus on adaptation, that we undermine the global capacity to basically reach the net zero targets. And I say that because issues of vulnerability, as we've seen, have been such that you've got a lot of entities, sorry, a lot of countries today, not just vulnerable communities that are dealing with issues of adaptation. What we've seen since COP21 is that I think 25% of the funds that have been available have gone to adaptation and 75% to mitigation. It tends to be easier for donors to focus on mitigation and for the private sector to focus on mitigation. But without the policies, without the planning, without the grants to support issues of vulnerability, then you're not able to focus on mitigation. The other thing that I would add is that there are new instruments that help in this respect. The disaster risk bonds, which when I was treasurer at the World Bank, we were very involved in supporting, has helped a lot of nations in terms of making sure that they can set aside their budget for issues that for disasters that they are aware of, and then place instruments on the market or that are insurance in nature. And so they've been able to respond to earthquakes, to other natural disasters as a result of innovative instruments. And of course, blended financing is also important. So you can use public sector money, you can use money that that comes from bilaterals and multilaterals to focus on those areas while you're building out for mitigation. So it's a mix of both. So right now I'm at 50-50, but 25 to 75% is absolutely sad.
That we lost you for a large part of that, and we're coming towards the end of this session. But I'll start with you for maybe the final question, which is really, I was very struck by both of your very impassioned plea for us to share the future. And I remember about 20 years ago, Gracia Machel, Nelson Mandela's wife, speaking about we need to look after our neighbour. It's just, you have to define who your neighbour is. Is it the person that lives next door to you, or the person that lives in the next country, or even the next continent? And I think, we were hearing that, tonight from both of you. What do you think we can do to jointly own this endeavour of the race to net zero? What do you think, we as citizens and we as corporations and we as voters can do to make that a joint endeavour?
Is this for me?
Go ahead, Hakima. Can you hear? No. Oh. Ah.
While we're waiting for her.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You're right.
No, I was going to. I think Hakim also shared some of what I'm going to share, which is we have to see the world as one human race. We have to see the world as borderless. I think it was Dame Susan Rice who talked about the issues around migration. There are security issues that get created. So if people think they can build a fortress around themselves and protect themselves without thinking about others, we've seen various examples of why that is not the case. So I would say the perspective that we're all in this one world, one race, is important.